Greetings all, and thank you for joining us for the Living Legacy Seminar. We're so happy to have you here. I'm going to invite you to sing with me. I'm Reggie Harris, co-president and musical director of the Living Legacy Project. We're in for an exciting evening, one filled with information, conversation, hopefully a line toward hope. Sing along. Well, I woke up this morning with my mind straight on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Sing again, we say, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind. It was a stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah. Well, I'm singing and praying with my mind. Sing it, say, stayed on freedom. I'm singing and praying with my mind. Stayed on freedom. Singing and praying with my mind. Oh, my mind is stayed on freedom. Hallelujah. 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 We're walking and talking with the minds stayed on freedom. Walking and talking with my mind stayed on freedom. I'm walking and talking with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Well, we gotta walk, we gotta walk, we gotta walk with your mind on freedom. Walk, we gotta walk, we gotta walk with your mind on freedom. Whoa, walk, we gotta walk, and then we'll talk. We gotta talk with your mind on freedom. Talk, we gotta talk with the mind on freedom. Oh, talk, sing it with me. Said I woke up this morning with my mind. Oh, it was a stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning, it was stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, indeed, I do welcome you to Speaking Truth, Countering Disinformation About Racial History. And we're singing to get us in the mood for a wonderful evening of conversation about issues of freedom. And tonight we are talking about the 1619 Project. And certainly in that time, that early time of slavery, folks were singing to remind themselves, those who had come across the ocean on the Middle Passage, to sing and remind themselves that they needed to be focused on freedom. No more auction block for me, no more, no more, no more auction block for me, many thousand gone. No more master's call for me, no more, no more, no more master's call for me, many thousand gone. No more driver's lash for me, no more, no more, no more driver's lash for me. for me, many thousand gone. No more mistress call for me, no more, no more. No more peck of corn for me, many thousand gone. No more auction block for me, no more, no more. No more auction block for me, many thousand gone. Many thousand gone, many thousand gone, many thousand gone. The songs that people sang were the songs that rose out of their hearts, and they were singing for freedom. They were singing to remind themselves, but they were singing to resist. No more auction block for me. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Singing songs like Wade in the Water. God's gonna trouble the water. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a song that people used to sing as they were making their way to freedom. Reminded them that as they kept their feet moving, they also had to get water wherever they could from rivers and streams. And those same rivers and streams would keep them from leaving tracks if they walked through the water. I say, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Who with us children all are dressed in red? We say, God's gonna trouble the water. They must be the ones that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. We say, who with us children all are dressed in black? God's gonna trouble the water. They're never, 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 never going back. God's gonna trouble the. Sing it with me, say, wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Songs keep us reminded that the struggle is still on.
Welcome. Welcome to tonight's webinar on the 1619 Project. In August of 2019, the New York Times published the 1619 Project, noting the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans being landed in English-speaking North America. In an editor's note, it was written, out of slavery and the anti-Black racism it required grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, diet and popular music, the inequities of its public health and education, its astonishing penchant for violence, its income inequality, the example it sets for the world as a land of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and the endemic racial fears and hatreds that continue to plague it to this day. The seeds of all that were planted long before our official birth date in 1776, when the men known as our founders formally declared independence from Britain. So that's what we're going to be exploring tonight with my co-moderator, Reggie Harris, and Dion Brayman and Daniel Alexander Coles. I'm Gordon Gibson. I'm one of the founders of the Living Legacy Project. And I want to note at the beginning of this that I'm kind of a poster child for the need that the 1619 Project answered, because I went through a pretty good public high school, took the usual history courses, and then I earned a bachelor's degree in history from Yale University, and I had zero African history. I had near zero African American history. There was some in the course I took on the South in American history. The one Black written source that I recall reading was Up from Slavery. But almost everything about that course looked from a white angle of vision at that history. And my first lecture in African history was delivered by SNCC worker Ralph Featherstone in jail in Selma, Alabama. In some ways, I learned more in jail than I did in Yale. Our education system failed me. I'd like to ask the others here tonight, how did your education do in bringing you African American history and the African background to that African American history? Dion Grayman, what can you tell us about you?
Thank you, Gordon Gibson. So my education began at home. My parents, my grandparents, my extended family. I learned about who I was and where I came from at home. So by the time I got to school, there was a lot that I already knew. I'm remembering, I had to look up the name just to make sure, like in a moment of divine synchronicity, I received a gift of comic books when I was maybe 7 or 8, the Golden Legacy series, which chronicled African American history from actually starting with, if I remember right, the Kingdom of Mansa Musa, and included Crispus Attucks as the first person to be killed in the Revolutionary War. And I learned about Toussaint L'Ouverture and Haiti. And I learned about Benjamin Banneker designing the streets of the capital after the French L'Enfant. That name I could be missing, but like all of that I got at home. And I'm looking at like all of the people who are from Virginia. My paternal grandmother, Lois Goodrich Grayman, is from Lawrenceville, Virginia. And I learned so much about like her life, like by being in the kitchen with her. So African American history and African history, for me, my parents were my first educators. My family were my first educators. I think my parents insisted that I knew who I was, that would be both protection, right? And a way to defend myself. When I was in school and when I was, right, like just moving through life, they wanted me to know who I was and where I came from.
You're fortunate. You're fortunate. Daniel Alexander Coles, how about you?
Well, thank you, Dion. You really took me back, because, I've been thinking about this question. I was thinking about one more, my middle school and high school experiences, and thinking a lot about particularly like the 1619 Project, right? And sort of a lot of the information, right, that is shared in that project. And, I loved history. In the college, just loved history. It was a public policy major, but so I took a lot of history as a part of that. And those spaces were completely devoid of the kind of information, history, knowledge, and facts that the 1619 Project encompasses. But I'm going to say my salvation was in elementary school. I went to pretty much an all-Black elementary school. And, one of the things Dion and I have actually talked about is the fact that I had a lot of Black teachers in my elementary school. And I was shocked when I came and had conversations with a lot of my colleagues here in New York, and they never had Black teachers. I mean, there's never, and maybe one in college or something like that. But my teachers actually taught my history. They taught Black history, and it wasn't like relegated to Black History Month. It was a regular thing.
It was a regular
So
class.
I thought this is how all courses went, or how all learning education went. And it wasn't until I moved into private school and in my middle and high school where I realized that wasn't the case. But I too, like Leon, was grounded in a way with, I feel like, a knowledge of myself and my history that has always sort of whetted my appetite to find out what wasn't being presented, particularly in my middle and high school experience. And in my college, in college, I did gravitate towards the African and African American Studies department. So I did take, courses through there. But in the sort of regular history track in college, all of that information was absent.
Mm-hmm. Well, Reggie, my friend and co-moderator, what did you encounter?
Well, I think I fall somewhere in the middle of the landscape here. I was born in 1952, and so I went to school somewhere around 1956, 57. And I also had mostly Black teachers in my neighborhood in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I went to the Grover Cleveland Elementary School. And those teachers, I think there were probably 3 white teachers in my inner city Philadelphia school. And our teachers taught us a lot about having pride in ourselves and about working hard. But I don't really remember the word slavery coming up at all. I actually probably learned first in my church, because when I was probably 5 or 6 years old, my church, every February, which was Black History Week in those days, as Carter Woodson had just managed to start us on that journey, we would have Black History programs every year. And we would learn kind of the ground level stuff, Frederick Douglass, and we learned a little something about Harriet Tubman, not too much, because not that much was known about her then. We learned about George Washington Carver. We learned a lot about Black poets and their reflections. But as to hearing about slavery, 1619, the general overview of the institution, there was nothing. And I didn't find out, for example, that there were Black loyalists and Blacks who fought, on both sides of the revolution. You talk about, Crispus Attucks. His name didn't come up for me until I actually was an adult and started researching a program on the Underground Railroad. So it all came very late. And as soon as I got my teeth into that, then it was off to the races. Mm-hmm. And I was stunned by the power of that legacy of what our presence was here in that time. And so the 1619 Project for me has been a lot of back learning. Obviously over the last few years, last 20 years or so, I've done a lot of my own research, but it's just amazing to me how through my entire school experience, we always used to joke that we came here as slaves and we worked hard. The Civil War happened and then everybody went to sleep for about, 57 years. And then we woke up and got busy with the Civil Rights Movement. Nothing, of course, could be further than the truth.
Okay, so because I didn't come from a Black family, I didn't have a Black teacher. So I was taking a summer school course in my college years. Did I have a Black teacher? There are some real handicaps to being white in this country. Some huge advantages, of course. I get more than a little bit of privilege, but I missed what you all got. Let me do a little bit more to introduce our panelists. Daniel Alexander Coles is the senior program manager for the Morningside Center for Teaching Social Responsibility in New York. And I trust that we're going to be hearing a little bit more about what that institution does. I imagine that may crop up in the course of your answers. Daniel holds degrees from Stanford, as he mentioned, the University of Washington, and Hunter College, and has a wide variety of experiences. Dion Grayman also holds degrees, in this case from Brooklyn College and Hunter College, and is a staff developer for the Morningside Center for Teaching Social Responsibility, training and support and so on in that role. And today we're going to be looking at what the 1619 Project is, what it really says, and what are its contributions to American history? What does it bring that we missed? And obviously, we could go on a long time about that. We also want to get to talking about how to talk about this with others. How do we address what's in there and why it's important? Because we are getting a lot of pushback from people with my sort of complexion who are saying, "Oh, we can't spend time talking about those. Those are dangerous subjects." So let me ask, what do you see as the contributions of the 1619 Project? Daniel, what do you see 1619 Project bringing to the public consciousness?
Well, a lot, is a lot. I mean, I think that clearly the platform that the 1619 Project launched on was huge. When you think about the New York Times, right, and the magazine supplement and all of the resources that go along with it, all the teacher education resources, there's a podcast that go along with it, all sorts of lesson plans, ways in which teachers can, exchange, their own methods of teaching, lessons around all of the different topics. That it was enormous in that way. And I suspect that that's part of the reason why the pushback came. Dion and I were talking about the fact that in some ways, Nikole Hannah, I'm so sorry.
Jones.
Jones. Thank you, Jones.
Mm-hmm.
That she hadn't said anything that hadn't been said before, in a sense. And what I mean by that is that one, that American history is full of omissions, errors as it's taught, right? Outright lies. I mean, I was reminded of the book by James Lowen, Lies My Teacher Told Me, right? That classic book that, talks about all the textbooks and, how much they get wrong. But I was thinking about so many people. James Baldwin has that wonderful quote about American history being longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it, right? So I felt like, the argument, the claim that they're making is one that has been made before, but the fact that it had this kind of exposure, this kind of support, this kind of platform, and the people involved in it, right? Khalil Gibran Muhammad was someone whose work I had known before in terms of his book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Urban America. Matthew Desmond's book on Evicted, talking about housing and poverty and something, I think, in American City. So his book, and of course, Brian Stevenson. I mean, lots of people who are major, right, forces nationally were all associated with this, right? So, so I feel like on one level, right, this idea of resetting, or providing a different lens, right, for looking at our society, right, and questioning this narrative, right, that we've been told and indoctrinated with, right, that she's, that project is really shaking that up. And I think that is a tremendous contribution. The final thing I'll just say is that, I actually was a public school teacher here in New York City and co-taught, and I will actually put that in quotes in terms of co-taught, because I had so many classes that I was covering, but history was one of them. And American history, as taught in New York City public schools, and it's all geared towards the Regents exam. So the exam you have to teach too, but its menu and of what it covers and the concerns that it covers really does, it does a tremendous disservice, to educating students, about the history of this country and, the reality, I think, that the 1690 project is actually addressing.
Yeah, same, right? I'm thinking, so I didn't even mention like that I went to a predominantly Black elementary school, and Miss McCrory taught us Afro-American history because we were Afro-Americans back then. And it was a class, it didn't just happen in February, it was a class, right? And Gordon, when you were talking when you said that you learned more in jail than at Yale, like I'm a teacher by trade, right? I actually taught in prison. That was my first teaching job. And I taught on Rikers Island, and people are hearing a lot about Rikers Island in New York City. And I taught young men 16 to 18. And so as Daniel was just speaking, I'm having this thought that like I am living the 1619 project, right? Because I taught on Rikers Island for 6 years, and the majority of my students were young Black and brown men. The 6 years that I was there, I had 2 white young men, 2 white boys in 6 years, and they were only there for a short while, and they were only there because their parents they were poor, couldn't afford bail when they were first arrested, right? So there's that, right? And as heartbreaking, because they're really as horrific as being in a prison, being in a classroom, right? On Rikers Island in the C-74 building, which ironically was named the Adolescent Retention Welcome Center or something foolish like that. Because they were incarcerated, and there was not a lot of thought given to their educational well-being. My colleagues and I were able and free to teach what we wanted to teach. And so I taught we did a side-by-side read of Hamlet and Malcolm X, right? And I tell this when I'm training teachers now, the best lesson I ever taught, because they had a whole critical analytic discussion about whether or not Hamlet was a thug, right? Right? It was, and I wish we could have, it was the brilliance that was in that room, right? The brilliance that was in that room. And it was in that room because they had all been locked up. They had all been arrested and were awaiting trial. So that was one thought, that I am living the 1619 projects. When my grandparents left the apartheid South, both sides moved into public housing in Brooklyn, New York, right? My paternal grandfather was a returning veteran from World War II and couldn't move out to Levittown in Long Island, which were the suburbs, and moved from Harlem to Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is where I'm living now. But they lived in both sets of grandparents lived in public housing because that's what they were allotted, right? So I'm living the 1619 Project. My paternal grandfather, who was a World War II veteran, who played Reggie, he was a drummer in a jazz band, and that's what he did during the war, was also a letter carrier and had a heart attack and dropped dead on the job at the age of 57. I lived the 1619 Project, right? So the foolishness about critical race theory, because that is not a lens that is used inside, right, of education, that is specifically for law and a legal application, right? It presents the terrible and wonderful history of America in all of the ways that Black life and Blackness has been impacted by the systems that run this country. And I'm just like, we are living I am living the 1619 Project. So to when people have a critique about it, or the disconnect, the cognitive dissonance that's happening around the 1619 Project, it's baffling to me. It's baffling.
Well, that's such a great background from both of you. The earthquake that was the release of that project, I think, had to happen. You know, for those of us who have been sort of working away, pecking away, digging away at the history of America, trying to piece together these bits of information or chunks of information that we were able to uncover either on our own or if we've happened to fall into the right book or the right teacher or the right seminar. This project presented the material from that time in such a comprehensive way that all of the forces that have been working to disavow this history had nowhere to go. And it was just an explosion to see how all the pieces fit. And, you know, we've been, working at this and trying to teach it in ways that have not been supported by a project of this magnitude, where it really plugs into all of those powerful places. And so you see senators like Tom Cotton and people who also fall into the category of those who did not know, completely disarmed by the scholarship and the weight of the people who have contributed these pieces. The other thing that I think is absolutely brilliant is that the project is just founded and centered in story. It gives us narrative to go along with all of these pieces so that you cannot discount any of it without really accounting for the story. And the stories connect. So that's what I've been so grateful for. We've been talking about, somebody actually sent me this morning the story of Phyllis Wheatley. And, for a long time, we've been talking about firsts in the history of African Americans. He was the first to do this. She was the first to do that. They were the first to do this. And all along the way, people who opposing the truth of history have been saying, well, they were the exception, Well, they didn't come from anywhere. They somehow popped out. The email that I got today was on Phyllis Wheatley, as if Phyllis Wheatley was not part of some greater story as she landed here. And the person was just sort of very proud of themselves. It was a white person that wrote me, and and I said, I'm celebrating Phyllis Wheatley too. But Phyllis Wheatley was only one person who fell into a good situation that allowed her to rise. And the 18 men who pulled together this consortium to test her to see if she measured up focused on her alone, while millions of potential Phyllis Wheatleys were right there, and many of them were already working to change the frame. So that is what the 1619 Project has done. It has burst the bubble that somehow African Americans and the American story, they were just exceptions. We see now the entire playing field.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It really has been a game changer. It's shifted conversation a lot. There has been criticism of it, and I haven't been hugely impressed by the criticisms that I've read. Maybe the one that has struck home the most for me is that it may overemphasize slavery and the underlying anti-Black racism that was necessary to justify chattel slavery, isn't the only or the primary focal point for American history. But I'm suspicious when anybody says, "Well, this is the." I like the modifier "a" a lot better in almost every instance instead of the way to do something. Well, this is a good way to do something. But are there any critiques of the 1619 Project that you think are interesting, thought-provoking, worth talking about? Are they just basically racist reactions to being confronted with these realities, the real stories? They happened. They really happened. Tulsa happened. Wilmington, North Carolina happened. Crispus Attucks was a real person. So, are there any of the critiques that
hold water?
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm not a historian, so I'm gonna say like one of the critiques I saw was around some of the factual claims, right, of one of the particular essays, the one by Matthew Desmond in particular. And for me, I'm going to say like the idea behind the project is, well, that the legacy, right, of this 250 years, as I've heard, Ta-Nehisi Coates and others, mention that, we've been a slave-holding society for longer than we've actually been a not slave-holding society. So the legacy of that, and I'm gonna say, and the refusal to look at the legacy. I mean, that's the other side of it, So a criticism about even like, it is not or the significance of it. I mean, the refusal to look at that legacy is undeniable. Yeah. Every time that legacy is attempted to be acknowledged. I remember back when Bill Clinton was going to give some, an apology of some sort, and the way he was, I mean, he was, so he was intimidated, right, out of giving that kind of apology. And when you think about it, it's almost unconscionable that the country would not have given an apology, right? Dion, when you talk about your family's legacy, and I'm thinking that my maternal family is also from Virginia, but there's so much I don't know about my family. I don't know about who my great grandfather, who was the spouse, right? I mean, who he had his children with, right? There were 7 sons. Were their daughters, right? What happened to them? I mean, it's all of these things, and the fact that you would not apologize to citizens that you have harmed, right, in this way, to me, it's just unconscionable. So this idea, though, that the criticism, right, and that we that this legacy, and that I think also is the brilliance of the project, right, is in all of these different areas, right, these sort of 18 essays that explore, about housing, healthcare, capitalism, mass incarceration, education, like all of these areas, right? And the legacy, the imprint, right, of this voting, all of these things is, it's value, right? The need to really examine that. You mentioned the thing about its penchant for our country's penchants for violence,
Yeah.
right? The fact that we have not examined that. One of the things that, I read recently that I think I really love is the idea that concepts are crucial to cognition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't have the concept or a lack of a concept, correspondingly, interferes with everything: problem solving, thinking, explaining, being able to categorize all of that, right? So the fact that we have this concept, right, and enables us to look at our society in a way that we haven't before, to me is vitally important. The thing that you were talking about, Gordon, and this idea of like what's missing, I do think, and no project can be everything to anyone, right? But I do think, right, that this idea of our country and who we are, we have to include the fact that we have expropriated the land, right, of the indigenous people who were here, the millions and millions of people who died because of that, right? So I'm saying even using that as a lens, to me, is an important lens also to look at who we are, as a country.
Yeah, I don't have, there's nothing I can say about the like I can't, right? Like I can't. And I don't want to. But like what I am thinking, right, is, so Daniel, I'm thinking, like, I know where my last name comes from, right? My last name, Grayman, was because my great-great-great-grandfather, Samuel, was enslaved on Gray's plantation on the island of Antigua. Mm. And when he was granted his freedom, he was known as Gray's man. And so he kept that name. So that's how, right? Like that's how I got so I know that's how I got my last name, because an Englishman owned my family on the island of Antigua. So like, I don't know from critique, right? I don't know from criticism, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about how my family poured my identity into me. And I grew up as a little girl who loved reading Little House on the Prairie books and watching Shirley Temple, right? Right?
Yeah.
And my father had to say to me, well, let me tell you how these people are living on the prairie. Let me tell you who was living there before them and how they got this land,
yes.
Right? And then reading the essay about music, right? That was in the 1619 Project. I'm a proud first generation hip hopper, right? Right. And right, grappling with loving Shirley Temple, especially when Bill Robinson was in the movies, right? Loving Fred Astaire. I have a daughter who's a dancer, and I make her watch Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers movies, but also knowing that Fred Astaire used to stand in the Apollo to watch the Black dancers. So Fred Astaire got his swag from Harlem, right? Like, and I know he owes his whole career to Bojangles Robinson, right? But like being able to sit with that tension, to live in that tension, right? Like there's no space for the critique or criticism for me. because I'm still trying to reconcile, right? That I love to watch Fred Astaire dance, right? Like I'm still trying to I'm still trying to grapple with that. Like in a real kind of way. Like I'm still trying to like decide what that means. Like, and to me, like that's America, right? Like I have to grapple with the terrible, right? And the wonderful. And the fact that there are white people who think that they don't have to, or who don't do that, right? Like that's the part for me that the 1619 Project answers. No, you need to grapple with it, right? The fact that you went to Yale was because, right, enslaved people made it possible.
Yep.
Right? And we need that, like, that's like, yeah, we need to be in that. I don't really have space for the criticism. I really don't.
No. No.
One of the things that comes to me as I listen to you all, and I love that whole sense of, it's not a sense, I love the whole fact of the refusal to look at history and the refusal to identify information when it's there.
Mm-hmm.
I started, as I mentioned, I started in 1980, 81 to build a show about the Underground Railroad. There was so little information about the actual energy that the African American community put into the Underground Railroad. When I was coming along, it was white Quakers who got, upset that there was slavery, and they grabbed people and hit them in their homes and schools. That came at the same time I was getting information that George Washington was this wonderful man who never told a lie. There was very little critique of our national leaders. Nobody mentioned that, the first 12 presidents had slaves. Nobody mentioned any of the, the complicated history that went on. I didn't know that there were loyalists. They didn't teach us those things in those days. All along the time of process of education, scholars have been digging to find the truth of what happened, as opposed to these little children's stories that we've been told that people then take into their 40s, 50s, and 80s, believing that this is the country in which they live. So when I first seized on the idea of talking about Harriet Tubman, the story was basically one line, just perfect for kids. Harriet Tubman was born a slave, and she ran away on something called the Underground Railroad, and she decided to go back, and she saved over 150 people. She made 20 trips, and she was never caught. That's what we got. Well, as scholars began to dive into the primary records, and this is what we have with the 1619 Project. We have people who have spent time diving into the decks, and looking at the documents and following the leads. Well, we find out when we get to the end of Harriet Tubman's life that she didn't make 19 trips. She made about 11. Now, when that information came to me, I said, she made 11? That was huge. I don't know that I would have made one. Okay, so, But the scholars look at that. Where did she leave from? Well, now you can go through this lens right to the center of truth of each of these stories. And you can piece them together to see what the tension was in the nation. And you can come out of that with something that we can not only teach our children in terms of what scholarship does and what the real tensions of history are, but you can also, in a very beautiful way, get them excited to become scholars on their own, so that in present day, they can look at what we're doing now, which is changing the very history of last week, and they can begin to identify how those stories were concocted and why they are there.
Yeah. The stories are crucially important, both the ones we tell and the ones we suppress. And I spent most of my professional career in churches. And in churches, sometimes there are secrets. Typically, it's pastoral misconduct of some kind, or maybe it's a lay leader who misconduct. And it permanently scars a congregation or even a denomination when that truth is suppressed when those truths are not told. Oh, we can't talk about that. And what I've been hearing said here is we as a nation have been suppressing the truths. And that's, if there are problems today, and I happen to think that there are some, more than a few, I think we can say it's because we have not been honest. And the 1619 Project was an important exercise in honesty. What do y'all think we need to be saying to people about the 1619 Project? How can we interact with people who say, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that stuff. I'm not sure I believe those things." How do we talk to those folks?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that we have to get people over the hump on feeling bad about not knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I've been able to use the 1619 Project and some of the stories rising out of it for the work that I do is because this is something I do all the time. I'm performing for elementary schools, middle schools, sometimes high schools when I get an opportunity, but they tend to have a little bit more reluctance to bring in people that aren't already there. But the general sense of things is that we have a whole nation that thinks they know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is an invitation. This wonderful treasure trove of discovery is an invitation to excite people about what they don't know, not in a sense that it is a personal failing,
Yeah.
but in the sense that you have the opportunity to find out more and get more context. And I think, you folks at Morningside, I mean, you're doing this in a very large way. You're also working with teachers to help them frame out, how to teach. The thing I found all the time when I was doing workshops for the Kennedy Center is I would get 60 teachers in a room and ask them a question about, the Reconstruction of the Civil Rights Movement, and maybe 3 of them knew anything. And they're being charged with going into the classroom and teaching their students. They felt bad in the workshops actually that I was doing turned into sessions where they could feel good about learning something new.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Reggie, I think like that, I've been thinking about that, like what is the barrier? And Tanara Burke and Brené Brown latest, their book, you are your best. What is it, Daniel? I'm drawing a blank.
I think you are your best selves.
You are your best selves.
Yeah, that's what it is.
But they talk a lot about shame and guilt,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And they talk about the burden of shame and guilt. And, like I had one teacher after a training, come up to me crying and saying, "I'm just trying to be a good white person."
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like,
Wow.
let's just try to be a good person. Let's try to be the best teacher we can be.
Yeah.
Because I don't know about the good, like I don't know if we can use that, right? Like we can't use that. Your students can't use your tears in the classroom, right? So like let's work on that. And I was thinking about the value of this. I was watching Dr. Gates's series on PBS, Finding Your Roots. On Tuesday night, he had Greta Carson, formerly of Fox News, and Don Lemon. Don Lemon finds out, like there's a part, there's a section where Dr. Gates is talking him through a ledger, and it is 4 of his ancestors, and together they were valued at $1,800. Don Lemon has this, like he's visibly moved.
Yeah.
Right? There was no shame.
Yeah.
Right? And I think when we talk about like, how might people interact with that? I think the first thing, white people, is the shame and the guilt doesn't serve you. It certainly doesn't serve us, right? But like the healing that needs to happen so that people can interact with these materials, right?
Mhm.
Like consider that a place of healing, because shame and guilt is going to keep us where we are, right? As a country.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a. Go ahead, David.
No, go ahead, Brady. Go ahead.
That whole issue of shame and guilt, one of the critiques that have come up, and one of particularly in the public forum, has been teaching this information makes white kids feel bad about themselves. And I heard that and I just laughed, because there were white people in history who did the right thing. And if you read your history, and if you read in those, I mean, there were abolitionists, who were putting their lives and their businesses and their, on the line. There were lawyers in that time who were, bringing legal defense against slavery. There were even politicians who, so the idea, and that's tying right into the shame and the guilt of making people feel bad about something that they do not know and the truth about. So that's a perfect point, Dion.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. One is how we actually do in some racial equity training, like when we really do try to share with educators facts, around housing segregation, right? And so neighborhoods, and that's attached to schooling. And so we use Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, by Forgotten History of How the U.S. Segregated America. And we do this sort of timeline, activity with them. And, I think one of the things we find with educators is again, like, this is new information. Like, I never knew this. And what it does is it ruptures the story. Yeah. Part of the story begins to rupture this story about how neighborhoods got the way they are. And a lot of, I say, deficit thinking around the people who are in segregated neighborhoods that suffer from, suffer or struggle with conditions around, poverty and, underemployment and all these sorts of things, right? But there's these narratives that when you don't have the facts, right, you fill in. Right, you fill in your own stories, and of course, right, there's stories around when we see anti-Black racism, but Black inferiority, and all sorts of things. So this idea of really giving people history, right, and facts around history that help them understand, the sort of social political context that schools exist in, and how this actually came into being, is really powerful. At the same time, I would say, as we engage educators around, racial equity work, what we also understand, and I think other people who do the work, we used a video by Jeffrey Robinson of the ACLU, and he starts this talk with his audience, right, and talking about how they're going to engage in something that is really hard, that's very difficult, right? Because you have been told throughout your whole life a certain story, right? Your parents told you this story, all of your schools told you this story, the college and universities told you this story. But when you find out that that story is a lie, and underneath it is an ugly truth, that there's to do that suddenly to people, there's a reaction to that, right? And so really it's also sort of trying to understand that on a human level, right? That our brains, like when we're sort of confronted with something that, is ugly, right? And goes against a truth that we held. Like I say, the way that we think of ourselves,
Yes.
the identity that we've constructed around ourselves. That is a very, it can be a very emotional thing, So I feel like, also sort of having that understanding of what happens to us as human beings when we find out something that on some level, right, is a part of our core identity, right? That we, again, have, we've invested in, in so many ways, how we understand ourselves. And all of a sudden that shook, then, the reaction to that, can come out in lots of different ways, anger, resistance, denial, shame, all sorts of stuff. So I feel like part of what we want to do is, how do we, guide people through or support people through that kind of process, because it's like it is on one level, there's a human reaction and a human response.
That's a powerful. And this is a very interesting thing coming at a time when we've had an administration, maybe a few, that have centered people in reclaiming their history. White people telling them that your history, your place in America is being taken from you. And now this treasure trove, this weighty, project comes out showing more information about the fact that there was more that you didn't know. And suddenly your face, I used to get this all the time from white students who would say, well, I don't have a history because we're just part of the melting pot. What do you do with that?
Maybe you explain, actually, it's more of a quilt than a melting pot. Yeah. So, somebody observed once in my hearing that in a melting pot, those on the bottom get scorched and the scum rises to the top.
Powerful images, I think. I'm interested in your work at Morningside, how you're integrating that into, the schools, the teachers, the groups that you're working with.
Yeah, no, we work with teachers to do several different things, but one of the, when I say several different things, it's this idea, we work with social and emotional learning skills. We work with this, the idea of restorative practices. So, how do you build a community where everyone has a sense of belonging, right? Has a sense of being seen and heard, and also what happens, how do you handle harm in that community, right? So you're not handling it in a punitive way, right? But you are actually trying to repair and restore relationships, but you have to sort of build those relationships. And at the center of that, though, is understanding the sort of complicated, multiple social identities that we all hold, right? And that they are, rooted in our society in different power and different privileges that we have, that are associated with our different identities. And so it's really crucial for educators to really understand, right? Really have a self-awareness about their multiple social identities, and then the identities of the community that they're in. Culture, we really work with educators to understand culture on a deep level, right? So we have this dominant culture, but we have lots of different ways of being, right? From groups of people within our society. And it is really essential to understand or begin to have some humility, right, around what your own cultural values and ways of being are, and in relationship to others. So that's what some of the work we do in racial equity, really educating educators around race and racism and that history in our country, and how it actually shows up in education is it's one of our we took about three strands of what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was in a school today. I was in a middle school today, which is unique because I'm a high school teacher and I'm coming to love middle school students. So if you've had middle school students, then you might know what I mean. And I was talking to two young men, Wayne and Trayvon, who was named after Trayvon Martin. He's 11 years old. And we're going to write a piece together.
Mm.
They asked me what very curious. They asked me what I do. And I told them one of the things that I do for Morningside, aside from being in schools, is I blog, I write for Morningside. And that led to, can we write with you? Because Trayvon is currently working on his autobiography at the ripe old age of 11.
That's middle school.
That's middle school, right? So like just like having a conversation with these with this 11 and 12-year-old, right, about why I'm in school, why I'm there, about Trayvon Martin, right? Like that was the highlight of my week today.
Yeah.
And as much as it is important to work with teachers and to weave those three threads together, really, right? Our work is disrupting the systems of harm for young people, right? That really is it. But to be able to have them be part of the disruption,
Yes.
right? Not just center them in it, but to equip them to lead the disruption,
Yes.
right? I think that is the most important work that we do at Morningside. Like it is the work that delights me. It brings me the most joy, but it is the most important work, right? Like, I am in my family, right, the first generation to experience full freedom from enslavement, right, and apartheid, right? Born in 1967. I am the first, right? My children and my nephews, right? And I've talked about this with Daniel. I was raised, you have to work twice as hard to be considered half as good. So I'm wearing a shirt that says Black excellence. My family drilled Black excellence into us. My sister and I, and my younger sister is a graduate of Yale Law School. She doesn't have children yet. My sister and I have never said to our children, you have to work twice as hard to be considered half as good, right? And I feel like that's progress, right? And so now, like our grandchildren, right? Like our goal, our vision, our hope is that they just get to be. That they just get to be. Because like children, Black children, brown children, they don't get just to be. And so like I want my work, right, at the end of it, that I supported Black and brown children in disrupting systems of harm, and that they just got to be.
That would be the world we all want to live in, should want to live in. Yes, that's where we need to arrive. Thank you so much, Yvonne and Daniel. You brought us wonderful insights. And Reggie and I really appreciate having this time with you. And we will very shortly sign out of this webinar, but there is a question answer discussion session to follow, and we look forward to interacting with a number of other people who also log into that. So this isn't the end of the evening for us. See you in a few minutes in that other context. So thank you very much, guests and audience. for being part of this webinar by Living Legacy Project, Speaking Truth, and attempting to undo the unreality and lies that support continuing racism. We need to do this work. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
You.